Got us all. There's no coincidence there.
I don't know how hot those mics are, but
Oh, thank you.
I had a similar incident at, there's a place called Vaquero? Anyway, it was really good, but then man,
Wait a minute.
yeah.
It says go ahead, I'm listening. I'm trying to say go to sleep.
What's that?
Yeah,
I'm trying to turn off my phone, and it keeps on asking me like what music I want to listen to or something.
Oh,
Your phone's gonna break out in a song during the press conference.
Okay. Whatever feels good to you. Okay. You feel good about that?
I do.
Who all standing up here?
those folks earlier.
Whoever wants to get people in the huddle here. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
We're not ready yet.
Yeah, we can hold. My shoe's inside, so.
Perfect timing.
And Jennifer's not.
Oh, she said she was on here. She might not know.
She may not know. Yeah, go grab her. I'm reading that book too, Chess.
Did y'all march on
It's really good.
HT?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're-
Get tough.
I've been
Well, I
for
got
everybody.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, walk
Yeah.
over to 7th Street.
Okay.
It's called Until We Reckon.
Yeah.
It's about a woman who runs the restorative justice program up in New York.
Cool.
It's a lot of success. Yeah.
Until we reckon.
Yeah, Until We Reckon.
Start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hi. Good morning, I'm Greg.
Crunched. Y'all wanna squeeze around a little?
Yeah.
Come on around.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. Good morning. Thank y'all so much for being here with us this morning before we go into our work session. This week, the Austin City Council has a really important opportunity to lead on criminal justice reform, on marijuana policy reform, on taking action that can lead our cities and our state to better prioritize our resources, to better, advance racial equity, and to just do the common sense right thing. I'm thankful that I've got my co-sponsors here along with advocates and members of the community to talk about the resolution on the agenda today. We know that too many Austinites have had their lives derailed by a low-level marijuana offense. People have lost their jobs. They can lose their student financial aid. Families could even be separated by deportation when we overly enforce low-level offenses that could result in arrests or in warrants and challenges for people to pay fines, to be able to make it down to the courthouse. And it just makes sense in this environment for us to lead the way and for us to dedicate our limited resources on investing in our community rather than investing in pursuing low-level marijuana offenses. While the state of Texas comes out of the Stone Ages on this issue, while the state of Texas has asked up for us to invest additional resources in pursuing these cases, what this resolution says and does is that instead of dedicating additional resources in pursuing low-level marijuana cases, we no longer want to dedicate resources to doing that kind of work. I think it's the right thing to do. It's what the majority of Austinites, I think, believe is the right thing to do. And my hope is that we have strong support for this kind of reform from across the dais. I think that it's also really important for folks to understand that this has gone through some process. And we've got the chair. Actually, we have all the members of the Judicial Committee here that have been hearing this issue, talking about this issue, and stepping up and saying that low-level marijuana enforcement should just not be one of the high priorities of the city. We, as a city, actually have the Willie Nelson statue right across from right across the street from City Hall, but we have not actually had the sort of laid-back or open-minded attitude towards marijuana offenses that folks might think. Over the years, we've had hundreds of marijuana arrests and continue to give out citations for marijuana offenses. we did really important work with our Freedom City policies to actually drastically reduce the number of marijuana offenses, and that's something that or to drastically reduce the number of marijuana arrests, and that's something that we should be really proud of. But that work isn't over, and I think this resolution shows how we can become a city that is actually prioritizing other things in our community rather than potentially derailing people's lives over something that, frankly, the state of Texas, I hope, is on the path to eventually legalizing. And so I want to call up Mayor Pro Tem Delia Garza to give us her thoughts.
Good morning. Earlier this year, the state legislature created yet another unfunded mandate for local governments. I'm glad they took the step of legalizing hemp, but their haphazard approach has left local governments excuse me, with a bill for new and expensive testing that isn't widely available. This is the same legislative session in which lawmakers decided to impose an arbitrary cap on the revenue local governments can bring in, the revenue that funds things like expensive lab equipment. The state has created a problem that it expects local governments to fix, but it's also tied our hands, leaving us with fewer ways to do that. In response, Travis County, among other counties across the state, have made it clear that they won't use limited resources to prosecute low-level marijuana cases. That means that continuing to sink the city of Austin's limited resources into citing those low-level cases just doesn't make any sense. And frankly, I think it would be irresponsible given all the demands on our budget. I want to thank Councilmember Casar for working so hard to bring this resolution forward and asking for me to be a co-sponsor on this. I also want to recognize the fact that I'm very proud to be part of a council that has really put criminal justice reform efforts at the forefront, from the cite and release policies to standardizing our indigency findings to making sure that we are not putting people in jail for not being able to pay fines. And so I think this is another success of our 10-1 council, who have brought a diverse council and a much more progressive council in recognizing that we have limited resources and we have to prioritize those resources. And until the state takes responsibility and fixes the problem it's created, we have no choice but to stop wasting our limited resources. This has gone through a process. We discussed this at the Judicial Committee. I and Councilmember Casar have had meetings with our police chief and police staff, trying to figure out and strike what the right balance is to make sure that we aren't wasting resources, but we're also making sure this does not affect violent crime types of issues. I think this resolution strikes the balance that is in line with Austin's values and makes sure that we are also in line with understanding we have limited resources. We need to prioritize things like violent crime, and I'm proud to be part of this. And next up, I believe, is Emily Garrett.
Thank you. My name is Emily Garrett. I'm a managing attorney at the Texas Fair Defense Project, and many of the people we help, including many single mothers, have had their lives completely disrupted by possession of marijuana charges. They've gone to jail, they've had to live with warrants for years, they've had their driver's licenses revoked, they've lost their public benefits, been kicked out of public housing, and have been unable to find employment. This is all because of possession of marijuana laws. However, this last legislative session, one of those laws changed. As a result, prosecutors across Texas, including here in Travis County, have announced that they are no longer going to be prosecuting possession of marijuana cases without the costly testing requirement required under HB 1325. As a result of that, law enforcement agencies, including Travis County Sheriff's Office and the Round Rock Police Department, have stated that they are also no longer going to be enforcing low-level possession of marijuana cases because they know the charges will be automatically rejected by prosecutors. But here in Austin, people are still being arrested and cited for low-level possession charges, even though those cases are automatically being rejected by the prosecution. This is a tremendous waste of time and resources, and now some people want to be investing hundreds of thousands of dollars just so that we can start testing and prosecuting low-level possession cases again. On Thursday, we have our chance to stand up and say that we no longer want to be wasting our resources on low-level possession of marijuana charges, and that we will no longer want to be citing for low-level possession of marijuana charges that we know are automatically going to be rejected. Instead, we should be using our valuable police resources and time on real public safety priorities. This is not just the logical thing to do, this is the right thing to do. For far too long, we have been disproportionately citing and arresting low-income people of color for petty marijuana cases, creating a sense of fear and distrust in our legal system. I really want to thank the bill sponsors for bringing this resolution. It's a crucial step for equity and racial justice in Austin, and I'm very excited for Thursday. Thank you. I believe our next speaker is Councilmember Natasha Harper-Madison. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So we know that marijuana prohibition was originally born as a way to oppress communities of color. To this day, that is still the effective outcome of our laws. Black and brown people disproportionately suffer the consequences of these policies that feed the cycle of prison and poverty, a cycle that has brutalized and disenfranchised millions of Americans. The absurdity of it all is underscored by the fact that marijuana is now completely legal in 11 states and our own nation's capital. And even now, our own city's enforcement can be pretty selective. Just spend 5 minutes at ACL Fest or Eeyore's birthday, if you don't believe me. Polls show that the majority of Americans support legalization, and I'm certain it will inevitably happen in Texas one day, hopefully sooner rather than later. In the meantime, I see no reason to continue to spend scarce resources to mitigate the awkward position the legislature put us in, especially if it upholds a discriminatory system that disproportionately affects people of color. This item makes total sense, and I am more than pleased to join my colleagues and advocates here to support it. Thank you. Next, I believe we have, is Jennifer Pumphrey? There you are. Jennifer Pumphrey with Grassroots Leadership.
Hi, good morning. My name is Jennifer Pumphrey. I am a native Austinite, born and raised right here. Graduated from Travis High School just down the road. I'd like to start off by thanking all these amazing people and organizations that have come together, who've dedicated long days, nights, hours, years of their lives to this cause, and coming together to advocate for a more humane and holistic system, and for thinking out of the box to find new and creative ways to stop treating public health issues like criminal justice issues. People who are creating preventative and rehabilitative programs to assist those in need, as opposed to punishing people who are already victims of abuse and have been traumatized. People with mental health issues, people with addiction issues, and many other public health issues. Voting yes on this one resolution could mean the difference between someone becoming strung out on addictive pain medication, or being able to use a non-addictive, naturally grown plant to ease those ailments. While in high school, I was diagnosed with depression, deep-set PTSD, anxiety, and an extremely painful condition called interstitial cystitis. During a flare-up of the interstitial cystitis, you experience extreme pain that can last anywhere from an hour to weeks, pretty much incapacitating you, putting you inflammation, irritation. Even with these diagnoses, I managed to go on and graduate high school with all A's and B's, and like most high school students, I experimented with drugs and mostly smoking a little pot. After high school, I started working full-time as a waitress and enrolled in a couple classes at ACC. I got an apartment, a car, and the sky seemed to be the limit. Most who deal with depression, anxiety, and any ailment causing pain You have, I'm sorry. Like with most who deal with depression, anxiety, and any ailment causing pain, you have good days, you have bad days, and you have bearable days. I also dealt with issues resulting from my deep-set PTSD. My first experience with abuse was probably verbal abuse, but my first known case of being the victim of sexual abuse was when I was 4 by a close friend of the family. But when I was 19, my life changed and my world changed forever. And to this day, it isn't and will never be the same again. Due to an internal infection, I needed a day surgery. Due to the pain and not being very mobile, the plan was to stay at my mom's house and until I started feeling better. It was this night that my mother's husband, only 7 years older than I, decided after I'd fallen asleep and passed out from the pain medication that he was going to take off my clothes and sexually assault me. His 19-year-old stepdaughter. I'll spare the details and skip to the following day, where I was forced by a friend to tell my mother, and I knew that telling my mother was going to be even tougher than dealing with the situation itself. I knew enough about the situation that I'd been violated in a way that was inexcusable and done in a way and in a time that I did not have the capacity to defend myself. Finally, I came to and realized what was going on. I got up and ran. Luckily, I had a friend that lived across 2 blocks away, and running to my friend's house at 2 o'clock in the morning, I ended up crying myself to sleep. The next day, was more horrible than the previous night had been. I knew telling my mother what had happened would be much worse. After all, I was accusing the only man that she had ever loved of sexually assaulting her daughter. I spent hours that afternoon arguing with her, having to defend myself against statements like, "You probably asked for it," or "It probably didn't happen at all, and if it did happen, there's no reason he should have to spend the rest of his life labeled a sex offender over a mistake he made while he was drunk." I'd expected this to be a difficult conversation due to my mother and I's rocky relationship, but I never for a moment thought she would try to keep me from informing the police of what had happened. After realizing there was no words I could say to change my mother's perspective, I reached for the phone to call the police. I dialed 911, and as soon as she realized this, a struggle ensued. Once it was all over, she ended up with the phone in her hand and proceeded to tell the dispatcher that her 19-year-old daughter was attacking her and threatening suicide. I tried to yell on the phone and tell the truth, but at this point it was my word against hers. Being the naive 19-year-old that I was, I never could have dreamed up the hell that would ensue over the next 6 weeks. The police showed up minutes later, arriving as I was arriving. Upon arrival, I was confronted by 2 dismissive and highly agitated police officers. At this point, I just wanted to leave. I wanted to grab my purse, my overnight bag, and just go. But as most people know, if police are called for a domestic violence charge, someone is going to jail. I hadn't done anything illegal and thought naively this gave me the right to leave, so I grabbed my bags and began to walk away. I'd gotten about 2 steps before the officer grabbed me by the arm and said, "Not so fast. This is your mother's property, and she has given us permission to search your possessions." As he snatched my bag out of my hand, in complete ignorance that my boyfriend had left a joint in my purse the night before, knowing I was going to be in pain the next day. While the search was in progress, I was irate. After all I'd been through, this is how I was treated. The next words out of the police officer's mouth changed my life to this day until the day that I die. He says with a smirk on his face, "What have we got here?" I had no clue what he was talking about until he pulled out a tiny little baggie, less than a gram of marijuana in it, and held it up for me to see. Before I could even say a word, I was in handcuffs and being shoved into the back of a cop car. Due to what my mother had told them and what my own combative attitude, I was placed on suicide watch, and the psych doc had just finished his rounds for that week. Just my luck. I was told I'd have to wait until the next week to get a release from the doctor that I was not a threat to myself or to others. I was not given a bond or clothes or even a blanket. Due to a lack in personnel, the doctor wasn't able to make it out to see me the next week. So on the third week, I finally got to see the doctor. Then he decided I was only telling him what he wanted to hear, and decided I needed one more week of observation. Due to the things my own mother had said in her statement out of spite, and the fact that I had a little marijuana on me, I ended up spending over 6 weeks in jail for less than a gram of marijuana, causing me to lose my job, my car, my apartment, and I had to drop my classes at ACC because there was no way I could catch up after 6 weeks, making it impossible for me to qualify for another grant because of my completion rate. I lost everything in those 6 weeks, including what little support I'd had from my family previous to that. I look back on my life now and I wonder what things would have been like had I just not tried to report a sex offender, had I not tried to stick up for myself. Sad when you think of it that way, but it's the truth. And once you're caught up in this system, it nearly takes an act of God to get out of it. For the marijuana, they offered me 6 months probation. I thought this will be easy. Although with no car, no job, no place to live, basically equaled non-compliance. I couldn't keep up with my monthly probation fees, pay for or get to the classes and treatment they recommended, not to mention trying to find a job that would hire me on probation and let me off enough to attend the mandatory meetings. Something as small and seemingly so innocent as a tiny joint changed my life and ultimately gave me a life sentence of struggling to find gainful employment and decent, affordable housing. Who knows what I could have accomplished had I just kept my mouth shut. This, by far, is not the kind of justice system we want to leave for our children to have to navigate. Voting yes on this resolution is one small step we can make to ensure that nonviolent, traumatized survivors like myself don't have to go through a system that only further traumatizes and harms, but finds help and treatment finds the help and treatment necessary to heal and help make a better life for themselves, and not leaving them homeless, jobless, and little to no assistance to pick themselves up and build a healthy, productive life for themselves. Many other states and countries have found holistic, rehabilitative, and preventative treatments to deal with these types of public health issues. As being one of the fastest growing cities in the world, it's time we do the same. Please vote yes to Resolution 59. Thank you for letting me tell my story and for standing united to bring about a more just system for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for your bravery and joining us this morning to tell your story. That cannot be easy, to have to re-traumatize yourself, to share your experience with the community and with us here today. My name is Jimmy Flannigan. I'm the City Council member for District 6. I am also the chair of the Judicial Committee. I'm glad to be here with my fellow committee members in support of this resolution. Thank you, Councilmember Casar, for bringing this to the council agenda this week. I think there's something really important for the community to understand with the action that we're taking today. This is not decriminalization. We are not decriminalizing marijuana today. That is a conversation for another day, and frankly, in another building. And I really hope that our colleagues up the street, up Congress Avenue, take this issue up in the next legislative session. But today, we can do, dare I say, the fiscally conservative thing, and look at the resources that we are expending in our police department to enforce a law that is no longer enforceable. That district attorneys, both in Travis and Williamson County, where I live and represent, have said that it is impossible to fairly enforce this new legislative decision. That police department in Round Rock went first. Frankly, I'm a little embarrassed by that. We should have gone first. But happy to join our friends in Round Rock in making the right decision for our community and for our budgets. We have very limited resources, as my colleagues have said. We have a lot of challenges in this community, things that we need to get done, things that the public is asking us to get done. The thing I am never told they want is arrests and citations for low-level amounts of marijuana. There's no one in this community that I'm hearing from that is asking us to do that. And in fact, the legislature has made it impossible to do so anyway. So I'm glad that we will be taking this decision today. I fully expect this to pass in our council meeting, and that we can, as a city, move forward to the next round of challenges that we are trying to solve. Now I want to bring up Chaz Moore from the Austin Justice Coalition.
Thank you. First, I just want to say I'm grateful for our rookie councilwoman, Natasha Harper-Madison, for hitting the ground running. Also grateful for our seasoned council members who have, in large part, been on the front line of criminal justice reform on the city level. Also want to thank Emily Garrick and Chris for being the advocates on the front line for this. And again, I want to reiterate what Jimmy said. Thank you for sharing your story. Never a very easy thing to do. I want to read an excerpt from a book that I'm not getting paid to read from. Just throwing it out there. It's called Until We Reckon by Daniel Serrett. And she says the work of creating a world in which pathways to repair are the norm rather than the exception is fundamentally the work of culture change. It will require not just new programs and new resources, but also new ways of thinking and acting with one another. We make a grave error if we mistake policy change for culture change. Changes in law and changing hearts and minds are not the same. And on the whole, policy flows from culture, not the reverse. But we will make a comparably grave error if we wait for the culture to change before changing our policies, or if we underestimate the ways in which policy, when deployed accountably and strategically, can remove the barriers, foster support, and be mobilized as a force for larger shifts. So I want to reiterate what Jimmy is saying. We're not making weed legal here in Austin. I know there's going to be some people from all other sides that are saying we're doing that. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is, again, the fiscally responsible thing is not giving more money into the $3 trillion that we spend as a nation on low-level marijuana arrests. We thrive and we love to boast ourselves as a city that are doing or that is doing progressive and liberal things, that's righting the wrongs of the past. And in order for us to do that, we have to do things like this. So again, I'm happy to stand with Texas Fair Defense Project and Emily and Chris, wherever he is these days, and all of our city council members as we continue to do our job with reckoning with some of the past mistakes that we as a city have made, and moving forward into hopefully a more equitable and inclusive society. So I'm back in the hands of Greg.
Jennifer, I want to thank you too for coming and sharing your story. It's really important, again, as Chaz mentioned, to recognize that the criminalization of marijuana rests at the state level. The state can choose to do what I believe is the right thing, which is decriminalize or hopefully legalize marijuana. But the question that faces us here today is, do we want in this moment to dedicate extra resources to going after low-level marijuana cases? There are folks that are suffering, and marijuana alleviates their suffering. Do we want to dedicate additional resources to pursuing those cases? There are people who just getting together with friends are relieving stress and doing something that is less dangerous than having a few beers. Do we want to dedicate extra resources to going after that and potentially messing up folks' lives? Of course not. This is a step for criminal justice reform. This is a step for racial equity, and it's just common sense. And so I'm really thankful to all of the advocates and the community pushing for this, again, for my co-sponsors. We also have Paul Quincy here, who's a defense attorney who faces, who defends many of these cases and has to deal with expunging cases to make sure that folks don't continue to be haunted and chased after by low-level marijuana charges. For so long, the war on drugs has just really been a war on people and on communities of color especially. And I'm excited that Austin is going to continue to lead in this way. So happy to take some questions. I know one of the questions I've heard oftentimes from folks in the press leading up to this point is, will this impact the way that we do toxicology or address violent crime issues or any of those sorts of things, or felony level trafficking? This does not this does not change the way that we have to handle any of that. This is, again, about those low level marijuana charges. So do we have any questions? We can, of course, break out for one-on-ones, but just wanted to see if you have questions for me or anybody back here.
What's the amount considered low level?
We are saying that we do not want to be dedicating resources to pursuing cases where it is a personal amount of marijuana, that is, without the intent to sell or distribute. And so that is, we are not dedicating resources to those sorts of cases, and that's a standard that's used right now. You have cases where it's personal versus cases where it is felony level distribution or with intent to sell.
Can someone explain how it's working right now? So AP is still citing, and folks are presumably showing up for what is supposed to be a court hearing, and they're just turned away?
That's right. So there's two pieces to this. What's happening now is that folks are primarily receiving citations because the council has done work to reduce discretionary arrests by over 85%. So in most cases, folks are getting citations right now, and it's up to the county system to let you know that the court date doesn't really mean anything and that the case isn't going to be prosecuted. However, the police department testified to the judicial committee that the police department is currently on the path to spending resources to get the testing capability to actually go back and make those cases a thing. Because there's a 2-year statute on these marijuana charges, 2-year statute of limitations, we could actually go and reactivate those cases by testing those old cases. Those cases currently aren't going anywhere, and why would we spend extra resources to go back and make those cases go somewhere? Clearly, the sky is not falling, and everything is going just fine related to those cases. So the goal is to not go and back charge those cases and not create the capability, not spend extra resources so that those citations start being pursued and those court dates start getting set.
So while APD has said they want to spend this money to be able to test this hemp or marijuana, whatever, this thing on Thursday, you guys are voting on would say we are not going to set aside that money for you guys to go ahead and do that.
Exactly. So that way that the cases that go back to June do not get prosecuted and do not have a court date set, and then cases moving forward aren't prosecuted or have a court date set, which then means that our police department can relook at their priorities and their policies to say, if we're going to be writing people citations where there's no penalty and no prosecution, then frankly there's better things for our police officers to do than to write people pieces of paper that don't have any penalty and don't mean anything.
And I would add, it's fair for the police department. It's fair for the department to ask for these resources when the council hasn't changed the policy. That is the right back and forth. Council sets the policy, APD goes out and enforces it. So until we change the policy, APD is trying to get all the resources they need to enforce the rules. So no one is in conflict here. The steps are going according to how the process is supposed to go, and now we're here to change the policy so that those equipment and the expenditure of those monies is not going to be necessary.
I agree with that.
So folks have said, this is not decriminalizing marijuana in Austin, but essentially it's cutting off any route towards any criminal penalty. So, we can go over semantics as much as we want, but that's essentially the effect.
Right. We are not changing the criminal law, but we are effectively choosing to not have penalties associated with low-level marijuana charges, and to eliminate as far as possible enforcement resources, given that there aren't going to be penalties because there is not the resource for the testing. Does that make sense to folks?
What is the threshold at which the marijuana, whether it's is volume by weight, discretionarily by the officer, at which point they no longer have the ability to say, dismiss that as what you were quote unquote determining it to be low level, where it changes from that to a higher level.
Yeah. Well, we've got some attorneys here, so we can have them chime. There currently is already a process for intent to sell or distribute, but I'll let you sort of describe it.
Yeah, so the resolution has an exception for felony level trafficking offenses. The reason that it's not just felony versus misdemeanor is because you can very easily have personal use amounts of marijuana substance because if it's done by weight. So let's say you have a brownie with some marijuana in it. It's going to be the entire weight of the brownie and not the weight of the plant substance that's in it. And so you can very, very easily just have a personal use brownie and get up to felony levels. The standard now in the resolution is that if it's felony level trafficking offenses, then you can still pursue testing and prosecution for that offense. Does that answer the question?
Well, it was like specifically, what is the quantification where it crosses that threshold for actual, not brownies and not other quote unquote edibles, I guess, but actual marijuana? What is the threshold? Where does that change?
Okay, so the resolution calls for a prohibition on felony trafficking levels. So the law doesn't prescribe a certain amount for what is felony intent to distribute. So it's really a totality of the circumstances, whether a particular case fits in to be a case that there was intent to distribute. So the law doesn't prescribe that, but the ordinance or the resolution does only speak to prosecuting for felony trafficking or intent to distribute cases. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it doesn't.
So there's not a cutoff in the law.
Prescribe to specifically just singular possession.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
The prosecutor's making that call.
Well, the prosecutors are not making the call. The prosecutors have decided that these cases should not be prosecuted. So if it's really actually the officer on the scene who's making the call whether it rises to the level of a trafficking offense or intent to distribute offense, and then the prosecutors would take it from there.
I think the confusing language is low level. I mean, and that's where I think he's getting with the quantification of how much. But you're saying there's no quantification. If an officer, you have some sort of 2 grams, and it's just you and the officer sees it's personal. Then that's going to be, there's no, I guess, quantification number that's attached to this low-level marijuana possession, I think is what's kind of the confusing language.
That's right. I mean, low level is not a legal term. Low level is just what we're describing as most of the offenses that would be covered in this in the resolution. Up to 4 ounces for a misdemeanor.
But for felony level, it's different for trafficking.
Yes.
Basically, so the reason it's confusing is because there are different levels for different weights for each kind of offense. There's a separate offense for distribution and trafficking, which can become a felony more easily, and then there's possession level offenses, which have a higher weight requirement to stay as a misdemeanor. And so the way that we've written it is to just have the cutoff at felony level trafficking offenses, which varies depending on where in the statute you're looking.
And to be clear, we're saying we're not going to be spending the money testing the misdemeanor cases. So there is a threshold for what is misdemeanor. So 2 grams is always going to be a misdemeanor case. But police officers currently have to determine whether something is a felony level trafficking offense. And when they determine that, there would be testing for that. So misdemeanor cases, we are saying we're not going to develop the testing for. And on felony cases, if there's an intent to distribute, which police officers already do regularly as their job, then there would be testing in those cases. Because some folks might have a vaporizer that has a certain weight, and in fact the law does not distinguish between the just a little baggie compared to having a vaporizer or the edible. If that makes sense. So misdemeanors cleared, felonies if there's intent to distribute.
Here's the allegory to the brownie. You're saying that you're
It's not yet
the apparatus and not the content.
And that's the way the state law is written.
Right.
We got to get y'all to a council meeting.
Okay. All right. Thank you guys.